Hi, so today we're going to be looking at brand and corporate reputation. So we've obviously spent the most of the module, we've been looking at focusing on the brand and generating equity and where that comes from. But it's also important that we consider an organisation's reputation and how that interfaces with the brand itself. It's difficult to take the two concepts apart because they're so deeply ingrained within one another, and where one stops and one begins. So a brand is obviously very much consumer facing, but equally can be important to stakeholders as well, and that's really where our reputation builds in. But as a consumer yourself, you probably recognise that actually, if an organisation has a poor reputation, that is likely to impact on your perception of their brand image as well. So we're just going to explore what reputation is, and consider its kind of interface with brands during today's lecture. Okay, so in today's lecture, these are some of the things we're going to be considering. So we're going to start off by exploring some definitions around what we think corporate reputation is. What does it consist and comprise of? Where does it derive from? Some of perhaps the influences, and start off by considering some of those links with brand and brand equity. It's really fundamental to our understanding of the interface to know why reputation is important and why it matters. Why should we be concerned about it? Why, as brand managers, this is something that we need to think about, and kind of, I guess, a little bit around how it's different from the brand, but equally how it feeds into it. We're going to cover lots of other aspects as well, but then we're going to kind of finish up by looking at how we measure reputation and looking at some of the tools that can help us with that too. So, if we just start off by thinking about some of the brands that we know and where their reputation has been potentially a flaw for them. Think about the behaviour of Volkswagen recently and some of their employees. So if we think about how their employees have behaved around the emissions scandal, and how that has potentially not only damaged their reputation as an organisation, so it could have impact on wider stakeholders, such as perceptions from regulators, from competitors and suppliers, but also investors, so rocks the financial market, but equally consumer confidence in the brand if consumers feel like they've been misled. So this is kind of a really good example of that interface between brand and reputation, and I guess kind of why it's important and why it matters, because of that impact that having a poor reputation as an organisation can equally have on your brand. I guess we could make an argument that it's difficult to have a really strong, well-developed brand with a substantial level of brand equity and have a poor reputation at the same time. And inevitably, the way you behave as an organisation, which kind of feeds more into your reputation than perhaps your brand, has that impact through the reputation onto the consumer facing brand, and eventually the image and confidence and sentiment towards that brand. Okay, so thinking about what reputation is, probably one of the most prolific writers around the idea of reputation and corporate reputation is von Braun, who published quite a bit of work in the 90s around what reputation is and how to measure it. And I guess you can partly say it's perhaps the conversations we have about an organisation, the things we say about it. But von Braun argues that reputation derives from a number of different aspects. So when we talk about brand equity, as shown on the model, we tend to talk about more brand focus elements that we have, such as how loyal our consumers are, how aware they are of us. Reputation digs a little bit deeper into the organisation, I guess. So here we're talking about the social image that the brand has, so its behaviour on a social level, how it relates to society and the kind of wider community that the organisation is a part of. Its financial image, so how it behaves financially, is it performing well? Does it have a high degree of debt, or is it able to be for financially sustainable. Product image, so how does the product perform? What are the quality judgments that we make? And that really does start to link in with perhaps more specifically Keller's model of brand equity, and its recruitment image. So how easy is it for this organisation to recruit staff? How does it behave towards the staff? And some of the other theories start to talk about reputation, digging a little bit deeper and going through many more elements. But this is quite a nice idea for you to think of reputation, of this like really multifaceted concept that's fed into by lots of different aspects of the organisation, its culture, and also equally sort of how it behaves, and not intrinsically but also extrinsically, so how it relates to other stakeholders and the wider community beyond those kind of more fixated brand relationships which tend to be much more consumer based. But when we look at the elements that von Broom argues makes up reputation, we can see how that feeds into brand equity. So there's like a really close consideration to some of the aspects that we talked about in lecture 3, where we looked at brand equity and the idea that the brand has some kind of intangible values beyond the core product, which makes it have some value, which turns it into an asset to the organisation. So interestingly, when you look at reputation from different discipline perspectives, they have quite different perceptions or definitions, if you like, of what reputation consists of. So if we look at the marketing definition, this kind of is a little bit more brand focused, I guess, because it's about those associations that we associate and identify with the company name. So it's kind of those thoughts, those emotions, the feelings, the associations that the brand name, the name of the company evokes in us. Accounting recognises that it's important and it creates value for customers, but is difficult to measure. So we're thinking about it more from an asset perspective there and how we might measure it. From an economic perspective, it's more about the way the company behaves and the signals that it gives off. That reputation is a signal of how it might behave in the future. Again, strategy considers it as an intangible asset. It's difficult for us to replicate, so it creates sustainable competitive advantage. This is something that we come back to because it's really, really important. Communication is about how the traits of that corporation allow us other stakeholders to develop relationships with us. From an organisational theory perspective, it's that cognitive representation that helps us as stakeholders be able to interpret, make meaning, make sense of the way the organisation behaves. And from a sociological perspective, it's that social construction, so something that we've constructed socially, and it comes from those relationships, that kind of social interaction with the stakeholders. So this is von Broom writing with some others in 2000. It's just interesting for us to note that just because we come up with a definition from a reputation point of view, that actually if you're coming at this from different perspectives, there's a different way you can conceive what a reputation is for an organisation. And you may note that when you look at a particular brand, that it aligns itself with one or the other of these reputational definitions, and that could just be down to the culture of the organisation or the leaders of that organisation and their vision. But it's interesting to note that there are these different perspectives out there depending on which kind of school of thought you sit in or ascribe to. So in von Broom's original work that was published in Harvard Business Review, he talked about where a good reputation might come from and what does it consist of. So it's this idea that we have credibility as an organisation. So we're credible, we're believable, what we do is relevant, if you like. And all of these different 4 aspects are two-way. So the more you do of this, the more it reinforces it, obviously. That we're reliable as an organisation, so that we behave consistently, and we are, as it says on it, trustworthy. So we're an organisation that can be trusted, all feeds into us having a positive reputation, and that we take responsibility for the things that we do. So remember on the last slide, we talked about this idea of it being linked to the behaviour of an organisation, and comes with that responsibility for the way that we behave. So it's not just about how you behave, but it's taking responsibility for that as well. So what Von Braun argued is that to have a what would be considered positive, good reputation, that you had to have these 4 aspects, and that they all feed into one another. So having one without the other is problematic. It's difficult to be truly credible without being trustworthy at the same time, or taking responsibility for your actions. So definitely worth you having a look at the article and reading it for yourself, but looking at those different network of factors that help to build but also sustain and reinforce a good reputation. Okay, so we've talked quite a lot about what reputation is and where it comes from, and you know, sort of breaking it down and what is a good reputation. But why is it important? Well, I guess you already saw on this earlier slide around the strategy definition that actually reputation has a close tie-in, or a positive reputation has a close tie-in with sustainable competitive advantage, which is the same really when we think about brand image and brand equity. So if we've got a brand that's got substantial equity, that's got all of those different aspects that Keller or Acre describe, and we can say it's really, really well differentiated from the competition, and actually that brand is really important to its customers and it develops sustainable relationships with them, then actually what that means is that it's difficult for other organisations, for competitors to replicate. Okay, so it gives us that sustainable competitive advantage. So remember that this is the idea. This little arrow on the slide shows us where we transition from a Me Too organisation right up to that sustainable competitive advantage, where we're in a position that our reputation is positive, but positive around different factors that are important to consumers and stakeholders, but making it sustainable and not just a regular competitive advantage is this idea of it's difficult for somebody else to copy. So think about, you know, if you were a new organisation today and you were wanting to compete with the reputation of a really leading manufacturer in the food industry, how would you compete? How would you replicate that? How could you copy it? You might be able to distill what their reputation consists of and break down the different constituent parts and examine that, but you wouldn't be able to replicate it easily or quickly, more importantly. Okay, so it's this idea that reputation is important, because if the be all and end all of being in business and being successful and effective as an organisation is having that sustainable competitive advantage, then having a poor reputation can hold us back from this. So it's not just that it's difficult to replicate. Having a poor reputation could prevent us from achieving sustainable competitive advantage, which is obviously what we're all about as organisations, and is very important. As we said on the last slide, reputation feeds into, or a positive, effective reputation feeds into that sustainable competitive advantage. But what are the other kind of more tactical and tangible benefits that we might receive from having a positive reputation? So first of all, you know, and this builds a lot on what we've talked about in terms of brand equity. So first of all, think about our consumer perspective. It can attract loyal customers to us. So having a positive reputation, being perceived to be a good organisation that behaves well, that looks after its stakeholders, can mean that your customers are equally as loyal. Remember that what we talked about in the initial lectures around consumer behaviour, and this idea that we will only really connect with brands that reflect who we are as individuals. So if you think about that idea, your reputation kind of has to align with the values and beliefs of that customer. So if that customer was a brand, how would they behave? What would they align their value system to? And that then can create some really resonant meaning with the end consumer. That means that they are loyal and they want to have a relationship with your brand, you know, fed through from the reputation. Equally, it can mean that we avoid activist customers. So it might be that, you know, we've got a little sign of Tescopoly on the slide here. So it might be that we want to avoid those customers that are perhaps criticising the way that we behave. So obviously by having a positive reputation, we're going to avoid some of those activist customers that might potentially cause reputational damage. It can reduce friction with regulators. So if regulators, as one of our key stakeholders, are buying into our credible, trustworthy reputation, and they know that we behave well as an organisation, it means that if we want to change or reshape anything that we're doing, if we want to innovate, then the regulators are going to be more on board with us. If we have a reputation for behaving badly, if we have a poor reputation, then inevitably that's going to have real dire consequences in terms of how heavily regulated we are. Just thinking about advertising as an example, the Advertising Standards Agency, if you have a reputation for being controversial in your advertising, they are going to really keep a much closer eye on you as an organisation than perhaps somebody who consistently stays well within the code of conduct. Equally, also means that you will attract and retain talented employees. And why is this important? Well, particularly if you're customer facing, having employees that are effective and productive can be really important. Equally, it means you're attracting the intellectual property within a particular industry. So it might be, if you're a key innovator, that it's really important that you have those talented employees working for you and that you're able to retain and keep them. Essentially, most of the organisations are nothing without their staff. So it's really important to an organisation from a brand and reputation point of view that they are able to retain any talented employees that they might attract. Equally, it's important that we know that recovering your reputation is much more difficult than building it and maintaining it. So actually building it in the first place can be relatively easy if you get it right and you consider some of the factors that we're talking about today. But recovering it can be problematic because you've created that additional perception around your brand, and trying to recover that is a lot much more difficult, harder work if I guess in terms of changing the way people perceive you. Okay, so what are the kind of things that influence our reputation? So this is more kind of thinking, once we've got an established reputation, what can happen? Where are the possible threats, I guess, in terms of, what might change perceptions around our reputation? So external, so if we consider things like the Pestel factors, so if legislation changes, and we don't comply, or we're not seen to comply, we're not quick enough to move. Think about some of those organisations that we've talked about in an earlier lecture, I think, around the brands that have recently revisited the sugar content within their fizzy drinks to ensure that as a brand they don't hit the sugar tax levy, but also that this is becoming a social problem that consumers and regulators are aware of. This idea that lots of these products have far too much sugar in them, and then they're bad for the consumer, in particular who are children. So if you're not seen to be complying with that, that can have some damage to your reputation. Relational, so this kind of tends to be, as Roper and Phil argue, this can be based on the industry that you're a part of. If your industry, say like the banking industry, so we've got HSBC here on the side, has a reputation of bad behaviour, it has a poor reputation or image, this can impact on the brands that operate within that industry. So it's kind of second hand, if you like, but if everybody's been seen to behave badly, it doesn't necessarily make it more acceptable. It means that even if you're not one of those brands, that one of those organisations that is behaving unfairly or poorly in one way or another, you can still be tarnished with that same brush. So that can be a little bit problematic from a reputational point of view. Equally, stuff that goes on within the organisation. So, we've got Sony on here because they were hacked, and they did blame external forces, but was it because of a lapse in security? There's been loads of instances, and we'll look at in the seminar the Ratner example where he argued that it was down to external forces, but sometimes organisations can be their own worst enemy, and perhaps the way you treat your staff, the conditions that they work in. These are often things that really upset other stakeholders and consumers and can be really very damaging for your reputation and very difficult to recover. So again, going back to some of the benefits, I guess you can flip some of those benefits in the sense that if they're not benefits, they can be problems for you. So if you're not dealing with some of these issues effectively, then potentially it can turn into a reputational nightmare. So again, Roper and Phil cover some interesting aspects around how our reputation is formed. So where does it come from? And they come up with these different factors that they think influence where your reputation comes from, how it is formed. So not like the last slide where it's more about what can happen to your reputation, where can it be damaged from. This is kind of focusing on where the reputation is generated from. So it touches on some of the areas we looked at earlier in terms of products and service quality, employee satisfaction, but equally thinks about how satisfied our customers are. How do we get a good reputation through really delivering exceptional customer service and keeping our customers happy? If we're known as the market leader, our position in the market can impact on our reputation. How innovative we are as an organisation, is that important? Is that something that we need to feed into our reputation? And that contextually will differ, so it's something we need to be aware of. Our vision and our leadership, if you think about a company that we've looked at quite a lot in this module, which is Ryanair, their brand is very much driven by the vision and the leadership of Michael O'Leary, and without him it'd be difficult to see how that reputation as a kind of really leading in terms of low cost and a really efficient business model. It's important that through succession planning they manage that effectively, but that's clearly fed into the reputation of the organisation. How we behave socially, which we talked about again a little bit earlier. So from a corporate social responsibility perspective, how profitable we are. So all of these different factors feed into, as argued by Roper and Phil, feed into how your reputation is formed. Some of them may be more important than others. So it's important to note that depending on the context that your organisation is in, it may be that one or the other of the different aspects are more or less important to reputation formation. And that, I guess, is for brand managers or PR professionals to be able to analyse and understand in terms of influence and perceptions around their reputation. Okay, so I spent a bit of time then talking about what reputation is. I guess it's important for us to consider how that then interfaces with the brand itself. So the literature is really quite ambiguous around this, and there's no sort of real, definitive separation of the two concepts, if you like. So there's little agreement, and it's fairly inconsistent and ambiguous, as are most, sort of definitions around different concepts that we cover in marketing. The study and the kind of management of brands is more focused on the brand rather than the product brand. So it's that kind of a really intangible element of the organisation. So that kind of has a kind of growing interwoven feeling around the reputation. So it's kind of as though the two are becoming much more closer together than they might have been before. So I guess historically the reputation might have been more around the image and the intangible element, and the brand's a little bit more product focused, but actually we're moving more towards all of it being more around that intangible element. So corporate branding allows you to really leverage the culture and the values, which are a really inherent part of the reputation. So again, the two really overlap here. But it's important that we note that things like the culture of an organisation, which you've leveraged into the reputation, are really difficult to imitate, to replicate. And we've talked about this quite a lot in terms of reputation already. So it allows us to leverage that, having that kind of interface. Okay. And equally, it kind of shows that from a reputational perspective, but from a brand perspective, we might be a little bit more focused on the consumer, I guess. So we might be more focused on who's going to use our brand, who's going to buy and connect with our brand. Whereas from a reputation perspective, it's more important that we manage all stakeholder expectations. So not just consumers, but we're considering employees, we're considering any regulators, suppliers, any other partners that we might be working with in networks, or whoever we may work with. So it's kind of going, I guess the reputation kind of goes a little bit beyond the brand, but the brand is kind of at the centre of what we are, who we are as an organisation, but it's kind of like a raw aura that surrounds the brand. If you're wanting to research your reputation, you can do this in the same way that you do on Interbrand. So you can look at the world's most valuable brands from Forbes, and it'll give you a little bit more than just kind of a brand equity perspective. It'll go deeper into the reputation as well. So it talks about who the top brands are in the world. So again, you could cross-reference that with Interbrand. And as we've already looked at earlier in the module in the equity lecture, this, where does the brand value come from? So again, Interbrand gives us some ideas around that. We can see here that, as I said earlier, that actually, it can take a long time to build a reputation through all those different aspects, but it is possible, but only 5 minutes to ruin it. So as an organisation, you have to really think about what you do and how you behave and what the possible reputational implications of that might be. So it's difficult for organisations because we can't always foresee every eventuality. It's often difficult to look at situations from lots of different perspectives. So Cadbury's launched a scheme quite a few years ago now, where children could swap consumption of chocolate bars for sports equipment. And essentially what they were trying to do as an organisation was to address the societal concern around sugar and obesity. Now, this is a little while ago when it wasn't perhaps so much of a prevalent issue as it is today. However, having said that, they've not really fully thought through what some of the media might say about this campaign, and actually it really caused them quite a few problems, and sort of wasn't wholly damaging, so it didn't do substantial damage to the brand, but it was a little bit problematic and was a bit embarrassing for them, in the sense that it made them look a bit foolish, if you like. Some of the quotes that the newspapers gave out were things around sort of, you'd have had to have done, a child would have had to have played, I don't know, 20,000 hours of basketball to work off the chocolate bars they'd have needed to consume to buy a basketball net. So it wasn't fully thought through. And when the media did some of the calculations, this caused them huge amounts of problems. Just to kind of minimise some of the reputational risk, Brady has this category, different categories, and things that we need to consider as organisations. So thinking about how we behave as a good citizen, how we behave in terms of our product quality, and what's our environmental credentials. So it's kind of thinking about our reputation from all these different aspects to ensure that we don't mess up. So not just thinking about the product quality and making sure the product's fit for purpose and our customers are delighted with it, but equally thinking about all the different aspects of our behaviour as an organisation and where things could potentially go wrong, what our motivations are, how well we are governed, do we have a history of making a profit. All of these different aspects need to be considered from a reputational perspective. Okay, so again, this is another method of measurement. So they're a little bit like the brand equity models, if you like. So it's this idea of the reputational quotient, and we look at these different dimensions and attributes. And as it says on the slide, it's not just considering consumers, but investors and the media and employees. And we look at how well in each area we think we behave as an organisation. So how well our reputation performs, if you like. You know, are we considered to be a good place to work? Do we have a record of profitability? So it's kind of like the risk factors we looked at on the last slide. And RepTrak also is a really useful model. Now you can go on the RepTrak site, if you just do a Google search of RepTrak, and this again gives you insights around how we behave. And it's a pretty handy measurement model. So it tells you across the top how we calculate the model. And again, it is very subjective because this is something that we are doing ourselves potentially. But if you are wanting to do like a really detailed assessment of a reputation of an organisation, you would look to substantiate some of the claims that you might make. If where is the evidence for an organisation being innovative? Where is the evidence of you being environmentally responsible? So I guess if the greater you want to evidence this, then and make it kind of more credible, searching for that secondary research can help you do that. Okay, so just to finish up then, obviously we've talked a lot about what reputation is and its interface with brand, and I'm hoping that you can really see that the two things are pretty interwoven. It's difficult to take them apart and clearly impact on one another. Clearly, because of that impact, it's really important, and it can be lost much more quickly than it is formed. So it's important that we're aware of what the potential risk factors are, and we are scrutinising our behaviour as organisations consistently to ensure that we're not perceived to be behaving badly or actually behaving badly. There are significant commercial advantages to us having this really strong, well-developed corporate reputation, not just from a brand perspective in terms of being a palatable brand that consumers want to connect with, but also from a stakeholder perspective. So think about some of those reputational benefits, just attracting the most talented staff, retaining them and having them work efficiently and effectively and enjoying where they work can be just as important. We can measure and keep pace of where our reputation's at, and perhaps this is something we should be doing in terms of benchmarking within our industry, seeing perhaps where we might perform well and where we might not, and we can map that out on something like the reputation quotient and make like a spidergram and look where we fall short of competitors or the industry standard, and just to make sure that our reputation is being leveraged as best it can, and the culture within the organisation is becoming an advantage, but it's not a barrier to us being successful and having a successful brand. But it's an enabler. So it's something that permits that, allows that, and leverages it.